Hello and welcome to the second part of this module. We are discussing image schema in this module, and so far we have seen what image schema is, what have been the historical background of this particular field, as to how the theories have come together, how various disciplines have converged upon the primary idea that certain experiences of our bodily experiences, physical experiences with respect to space and objects in space, and how we experience various perceptual interactions with the environment and so on, can be actually represented in a schematic way, probably is represented in a schematic way in the human mind. And this is not only an idea from the languages, linguistics, or but also from philosophy, from psychology, and from other disciplines also. The same ideas have been converged together, and they are largely there is an agreement upon that there is some amount of a schematic representation, schematic understanding that underlies all these, many of these recurring patterns, because human life is ultimately a recurrence of various patterns. So, many of the patterns can be grouped together as part of being one schema. So, for example, one of the most important and most productive image schema is that of a container image schema, and then there is source, path, goal. So, various kinds of movements of objects in space can be understood in terms of a path schema, source, path and goal schema, and so on. And similarly, that same idea can also go on to help us understand the abstract domains of experiences as well. So, starting from the physical embodied experiences of physical relationship with the objects to the complex understanding of abstract domains, so and so on and so forth. So, we have already looked at the definitional aspects, the historical aspects, and of course, we have discussed some of the most commonly utilized image schemas so far. Now, let us move on to the second part of our understanding on image schema. So, this part where we will discuss about this is the kind of a roadmap where we will discuss the language understanding, what is the role of image schema. We have arrived at image schema. Of course, there is a kind of a schematic understanding that has been distilled out of in fact, it has been called a distiller of experiences. So, image schemas are distillers of experiences. So, once we have distilled our experiences into getting the schematic representation, now how does it help us? How does it help us in various domains of human understanding? So, we will just try to briefly go over a few of these domains where image schema has been utilized to make to understand certain domains of human experience, like language understanding, and then creating and comprehending metaphor, image schema and its relationship with the brain, and of course, the computational modeling. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but this gives you a basic idea about the various domains, the variety of enterprises, variety of academic inquiries that benefit from the use of image schema, and how this theoretical position can help us add to our existing knowledge in these domains. So, the first and foremost, since we are this is a language course, let us look at how image schema helps us understand language. So, the claim that image schema underlie meaning in language means a listener understands a sentence by simulating the scenario. So, let us take a very simple example here. When we talk to each other, we understand each other, and when there are positions where there are situations when we fail to understand each other. Now, what happens is that we sometimes say that the meaning did not get across. The meaning that is generated out of the fundamental understanding on which the whole thing is based on is probably lost in translation somewhere. So, one aspect of that understanding is dependent upon the image schematic notions of the speaker and the hearer. And if the speaker and hearer both share the same image schematic notion of the object being talked about, the understanding is simple and straightforward. So, talking about I have a long journey ahead is very simple and almost universal, near universal way of looking at life. To talk about life, we have already seen in metaphor that life is often talked about in terms of a journey. So, what is happening here is I am looking at, I am creating my sentential output, the linguistic output to talk about my life by using the image schema of a journey. So, there is a source, path and goal image schema. So, this is the schema that we are using, and the other person, the hearer also has the same schematic understanding to map the sentence on. So, basically if you have the same image schema, if you are able to fathom the image schema, then you are able to simulate that scenario as in what is exactly happening. The simulation is a very interesting aspect of language processing, which we will see in greater detail towards the end of the course. We have a module on simulation. So, basically what we are looking at in this segment is that the simulation is dependent on the schematic understanding. So, we are able to create, we are able to abstract out the schema of the sentence and then think about it in embodied terms, and that is where comprehension really starts. So, a lot of studies have actually taken place, as I have said we will discuss it in greater detail, but a lot of data from to underlining the use of image schema in creating simulation while understanding language. This comes from the domain of what we call psycholinguistics. So, psycholinguistics typically looks at processing of language, not simply speaking and hearing, but processing as in what happens when we either comprehend or produce a sentence or a word or any aspect of language. So, what happens simultaneously, what are the psychological reality of understanding language, of processing language, as well as the neuronal reality. So, a large chunk of studies actually used sentences like this: he hammered the nail into the wall, and then you can also have a comparative sentence, he hammered the nail onto the floor. Now, both of these sentences basically mean almost the same thing, except that the orientation of the nail is different. So, what the speaker and the hearer are simulating in this particular case, if they match, then there is a smooth understanding of the scenario, but if there is the schema does not match, then there will be a problem. So, the results from a large number of studies using this kind of language pair, this kind of sentence pairs have shown that people actually create an image schematic nature of the event. So, we create an image schematic nature of the event in our brain. Basically, we activate the image schema, so to say, because the schema is already there, because of the embodied experiences throughout our life, which has seen this recurring pattern already. So, we are basically activating that schema, and as a result of which we are even though we are activating the schema, even though it is not explicitly mentioned in the sentence. All we need in this sentence to create the schema is into the wall, and on the other hand on the floor. These are the cues that activate the schema even when nothing about the schema is talked about on the surface. The linguistic output does not mention it anyway. So, this is one area of use of image schema, and how image schema and simulation go hand in hand, and why they are important in terms of language processing. Similarly, we have already looked at metaphor, how metaphors are created and how metaphors are understood. We have already seen that metaphors are primarily cross frame mapping. So, one frame of a concrete experience and an embodied physical lived experience is mapped onto another domain, which is somewhat similar, which is in the domain of abstract domain, which is understood through the concrete domain, and then thereby we get the metaphor. So, life is a journey. As we have already seen. So, what is happening here is how do we map one frame onto another is basically dependent on the shared image schema of these two frames. So, basically when we think about life, when we understand life, you take any particular aspect of life, there is a beginning, there is a journey, there are points on that journey. So, there are milestones of various ages, various achievements, and various kinds of so to say segments of life, childhood and then adolescence and adulthood and so on and so forth. You can have your own way of segmenting the entire life into various meaningful segment, whatever is meaningful for us. So, That is why the schema that it represents, that it actually gives, that is fleshed out in the entire experience, into the entire frame, is basically the same. So, both of the experiences, whether concrete or abstract in this case, can be understood by activating, by looking at, or by abstracting the image schema of source, path, goal, and hence we have a very perfect match of 1-to-1 mapping of source and target domain. So, this is how, for example, let us take an example like this. Categories are containers. Remember, when we talked about frame, talked about metaphor, metaphors are represented as x is y or a is b or whatever. So, basically frame A is equal to frame B, x is y. So, containers are categories, but this may not be the way we talk about it. So, linguistic manifestation is always much more flowery and much more, it has much more possibilities of manipulation, but at the end of it, at the root of it, categories or containers is the metaphor that we are talking about. So, when we say a sentence like humans fall in animal category, humans are part of animal category, you may change the sentence to make it sound better, but I have used a rudimentary sentence to make the point clear. So, humans fall in animal category, meaning that humans are part of animal category. So, what is happening here is that we are using the container image schema that we have already seen before. So, container image schema is the schema that binds the things together. So, on the one hand categories and on the other hand containers. So, categories can be a larger container that has animals into like animals are a category that has other humans and other things into it. Similarly, the animals are again part of a superimposed category, larger container, so to say, of living things, and so on and so forth. So, categories are containers is the metaphor which uses the image schema of container. So, this is what we mean by metaphors, frames and image schema are interrelated. So, this is how we show that relationship. Similarly, our favorite example, life is journey, this is the metaphor. So, the schema used here is the path schema and sentences like this. So, what we typically have when in a human society, in a human communicative situation, in a day to day life, what we have is this. We do not see either this or this or this or this. What we see or hear or what we are exposed to is the sentential, the linguistic output, like humans fall in animal category, we have a long way to go, it is curtains for him, we have hit a roadblock and so on and so forth. So, from here we back form into understanding the metaphor, and then once we have understood the metaphor, we can easily figure out the schema that is at the root of this. So, this is how it actually works, this is how the relationship really pans out. Then of course, like we have been saying from in the beginning of this course, that every linguistic aspect we have been trying to connect with the cognitive as well as the neural underpinning. So, in this case as well, image schema, when we talk about image schema, we have seen it in language, we have seen it in metaphor creation and so on and so forth. Now, there is also the neural underpinning of it. So, we have briefly talked about it in the introduction. So, now let us look at a very interesting domain of research in case of image schema with respect to childhood, with respect to the developmental stages of infants, small kids, as to how do we have image schema inbuilt as a result of only experiences, later life experiences, what are the contributing factors. So, we have already seen that the embodiment hypothesis makes a strong case for creation of image schema, that is the perceptual experiences, the lived experiences, and how it creates a conceptual understanding of a schematic representation and so on and so forth. However, there has been a recent development in this domain. So, the developmental course of image schema has been brought to focus by some researchers. This is a recent phenomena because Piaget, for a long time, Piaget's notions of the developmental stages of children from infancy to adulthood has dominated the psychological understanding of the development of children. So, Piaget viewed infancy as a completely sensory motor stage, and as a result of which it has no conceptual life. This is a stage, the infancy is a stage when children are experiencing through their sensory motor experiences the environment around them, and thereby they are building up their skills. So, at this stage the children are not infancy as in 4 months, 5 months, 6 months to 1 year, 9 months, around those are the ages, those are the stages which we are talking about here. So, at that level they are not expected, kids are not expected to have a conceptual life, as a result of which mental representations of schemas and so on and so forth may not really exist. However, in recent time it has been found out that kids are small children as small as 4 months or 6 months are actually capable of having higher order cognitive functions. There have been a large amount of studies and large amount of data that has come out of it from the first year of a child's life. Even before the child is 1 year old, there have been studies that shows that show that higher order cognitive functions are possible. And now, higher order cognitive functions cannot be possible without a conceptual life, without having some amount of mental representation of various things. So, one of the important claims of this that comes out from these findings is that the infants use image schema to generalize across perceptions, because image schema, remember, we abstract out, this is an abstraction of various perceptual experiences. So, basically means that using image schema we can generalize across perceptual experiences, and that is how we put them together in one category, that all these experiences are of the same category because they all share the schema. Similar findings have been reported by researchers working on infants in the first year of life. So, what are those things? Let us see a bit in detail. So, these are called pre-verbal concepts. So, the kids, the children that have been studied have taken part in many experiments, and which has given us the idea that children actually have some amount of some concepts that already exists by the time, even before they are 1 year of old, 1 year of age. So, these concepts are called pre-verbal concept, plainly because the verbal stage has not started. Kids are still children before 1 year are not able to speak in proper, they are not yet speaking the language as they will do in later stages. So, that is why it is called pre-verbal concepts. Now, the fact that children have been found to be having some amount of conceptual understanding, some amount of conceptual storage, some amount of schematic notions, means that certain things are probably primitives as in foundational aspects of human thought. In fact, very exciting research is still going on about neonatal and very small children, and there are also hypotheses that probably some of these things are are really primitives in the sense that we are born with it, but it's still the work is still going on in that domain. So, but largely these pre-verbal concepts in humans point to the possibility that there are certain primitives and foundational aspects of human thought, which probably includes image schematic understanding. And why is pre-verbal concepts very interesting to study is not only because it is we can then think of how the human mind is actually so to say coded, what are we born with, what are the primary tools that we are born with, but at the same time it also shows us that as this pre-verbal stage takes us to a particular phase in time, phase in developmental in a developmental phase of humans, when both culture and language have not had much opportunity to shape those ideas. Till now we have been talking about how language, how various structures of language actually impacts the way we look at life, how it probably has some amount of influence on the way cognitive functions actually work. Simultaneously, we have also looked at the socio-cultural realities of various communities and how they differ, and so on and so forth. So, the linguistic output and the intermixing of cultural input from that and so on and so forth probably has some amount of modulating effect on cognitive mechanism, and that is exactly why we need to look at the pre-verbal stage, the infancy of children, to see what are the concepts that we are probably born with, even before they have been influenced by either language or culture, or you name it, whatever is there. So, what are the foundational aspects of human thought? This is why it is important, and also these concepts actually are creating the entry point to language understanding. So, if the child has been born with some amount of foundational aspects of the schematic understanding, and obviously it grows as the child grows simultaneously along with the age, and then as the child starts learning language, this helps us, this act as an entry point to language understanding, because language as it is spoken in the surroundings is already fixed, it is already there, it already has its own structure, has its own conceptualization pattern, and so on and so forth. So, the child, by the time he or she starts to speak, by the time he or she makes an entry into that domain of language, he already has certain concepts in place. In fact, very interesting studies on barn owl has been carried out, as well as alongside human children, to see what are how those developments might actually be occurring. But those are of course outside the scope of this course. And so, what are the pre-verbal concepts that have been found out in children, that is understanding with regard to object and relational concepts, objects and their orientation and how they interact with each other in space, and the relational concepts between them. Early concepts about event as well as objects as well as event are there. So, this as far as objects are concerned, the understanding of object and their relationship with each other, that is one domain that have been found out to be present in infancy. Similarly, early concepts about event also is there. So, what does that consist of? Event notions consist of path notions like self motion, goal, and also of course, spatial relation like containment and support. All these things, as you might easily understand, point to the image schematic nature of abstraction of from various recurring patterns as to how we look at it. So, these are very fundamental understanding: containment, support, motion in terms of path and goal. These are fundamental understanding about things which is which has been found to be present in very small children, pre-verbal stages, children with pre-verbal stage. So, the studies that have been carried out, various kinds of paradigms have been used, primarily recall, inductive reference, and mental problem solving. So, children have been found to be able to take part in these various tasks, which basically take us to the understanding that we have seen just now. One of the foremost researchers in this, Mandler, called this concept creating mechanism. She has given a name to it, perceptual meaning analysis. So, this entire mechanism that is found in pre-verbal children, pre-verbal infants, and that is found through these tasks of recall and inductive reference and as well as mental problem solving. The name she has given is perceptual meaning analysis. So, findings suggest that children can abstract relations among diverse range of sensory perceptual events, and this of course fits with our understanding of what an image schema is. Some references are here. These are the some of the path breaking works that gives from where we get our data. If you can always look up those papers, they stand out as the most important in this domain. Secondly, now let us move on to the socio-cultural influence of image schema. So, many researchers have focused on the bodily origin of image schema. We have seen already that bodily origin, physical experiences, and so on and so forth, and then the experiences with the between the organism and the environment. Now, the research in there is yet another interesting domain in the research of first language acquisition. Language acquisition of course have various types. There is first language acquisition, second language acquisition, and so on. So, the research in first language acquisition also has pointed towards the manipulation of objects in material culture as a source. What is happening here is that on the one hand we have lived experiences, physical bodily experiences of body being a container of things and body being contained in many other things and so on and so forth. And then the relationship between the human body and the environment, all these are fine as a source of creating schemas, but it does not stop there. Researchers have found out that even the objects in the material culture, why material culture is important is that not all cultures across the world have the same material artifacts. So, in the mainstream society that we are becoming more and more homogeneous. So, more or less we are surrounded by similar kind of objects, a large array of objects. But if we go to cultures that are surrounded by lesser number of material objects, then we see a slight difference. So, that is exactly what the researchers mentioned here. Chris Sinha and his group has found out their studies, they carried out their studies on Zapotec children as well as English and Danish speaking children. So, children when they are learning the language, first language. So, depending on what language they are speaking. So, English acquiring children, Danish language acquiring children and Zapotec language acquiring children. So, what they find out is that this is just one example that I have taken from their studies. So, containment schema represented by in English and other many languages, we have the preposition in that includes contain, that basically takes us to the container image schema. The moment we say I am in problem, basically means that I am considering myself being surrounded by, or there is a boundary of problem around me. So, this is an abstract understanding. Similarly, we can I am in this room. So, I am physically inside this room. So, the containment image schema is activated the moment you use the word, the preposition in English. In other languages that might differ, the grammaticality might differ, but the containment image schema is activated. Now, when we say container, so there is tea in the cup, water in the bottle and so on and so forth. There is a bias towards the canonical orientation of the container. This is very important. What it means is that in case of English and Danish, the container, the thing that holds the actual object has an orientation that is canonical, as in the usual orientation. So, the straight orientation, the bottle is standing straight, the cup is straight and so on and so forth. This can also have a reverse orientation like the upside down orientation. So, the cup can be upside down, the bottle can be upside down, the box can be upside down and so on and so forth. But in case of English and Danish language, the containment image schema, container image schema represented by in typically has a bias towards the canonical orientation of the container. What Sinha and his group found out is that this is not the case with Zapotec children. In case of Zapotec children, because they are surrounded by the material artifacts in their culture are very different from the material artifacts in case of English and other such languages. So, in Zapotec the basket is a common very commonly utilized item. So, the basket is used not only for putting things inside it in its canonical orientation, but it is also used to cover things. So, in both cases the container image schema will be activated. So, not only when it is in canonical orientation, but also in the reverse orientation. So, in this language therefore, the image schema has no bias towards the orientation. This is something that is very interesting if you look at how schemas are. If in English language for example, when the container is in the reverse orientation, when it is upside down inverted, it will have a very different schema, it will be under. So, the ball is under the cup. There are those games where you see the cats and dogs play. They typically cats find out when the ball is under which of the glasses. There are so many glasses that will be rearranged and arranged and so on and so forth. And so, in that case we will not say the ball is in the cup, we will say ball is under the cup. But in case of Zapotec, in both cases the same containment image schema will be utilized. So, this is what we mean by socio-cultural influence. The influence, as Sinha calls it, the influence of the material culture on the creation and utilization of image schema in various languages. So, that is yet another interesting angle towards understanding image schema and how it really works, and what are the various angles of experience that might have a role to play in this. Similarly, there is yet another domain which is computational modeling, that utilizes the understanding of image schema. So, conceptual structures emerge out of spatial perceptual analysis of bodily as well as environmental interaction that we have already seen. So, because this is so fundamental, because of its the nature of the mechanism, which is an abstraction that can be taken out of various experiences, this, if you can model this, it can be used to create a model for learning process. So, as a keeping that as a fundamental premise, various researchers in various domains have tried to have utilized this and created various kinds of models. Most notably, the neural theory of language project by a group of researchers, they have used what is called the execution schema or X schema. Similarly, this X schema has been later on extended by Srini Narayanan and his group to model metaphorical reasoning about political economy. And similarly, of course, we have seen Regier's computational model for categorizing spatial relationships in Russian and other languages, which we have seen before. So, computational modeling is yet another area, AI is yet another area which uses the notion of image schema, albeit in a slightly different way, but the fundamental understanding remains the same. And then spatial schemata. We have actually the whole idea of schemata and image schema basically started out of spatial understanding, because we said that the objects in space and how they are related to each other and how they move in space and so on. So, the domain of understanding of spatial reasoning has been a very important domain towards creation of image schematic notions. So, let us move on to the spatial schemata, notions of spatial schemata. So, spatial representation refers to, what does it refer to? It refers to geometric properties of objects and the relationship between them, how one object looks, what are the orientations and functions, and then how are those things related to each other. This information about objects and their orientation and so on and so forth is arrived at through our senses, through various senses, primarily the modalities of vision, audition and haptic. Haptic is touch. So, we see and then we hear, we will see it in detail a little while. Now, even though there is a modality specific source of information with regard to spatial information, but the representation has to be either amodal or it has to be kind of a connecting link between these various modalities and something that that takes is to take this representation to the execution level. What we mean by execution level is that we get the information about spatial schemata through our vision, through hearing, through touch and so on and so forth, and then there is an abstraction of that information into the mind, and then that information is utilized for our behavioral output. How, what kind of behavioral output? It starts with a very simple notion of moving around. Until and unless we have figured out the layout of the room, we will be bumping into the objects. We never do that. That is of course, a different domain of study altogether, body schema. But this is what we mean. So, the schematic representation has to again be translatable to the behavioral output. So, this representation is translatable to the motor system, so that it can guide our behavior. So, this is the fundamental notion of spatial schemata. So, spatial representation is, as a result of which, is considered one of the basic conceptual representation. We must understand, we must have a map of schematic map of our environment, of the objects in the environment and so on and so forth to guide our movement around. So, this has been shown to be varying in terms of the biological entities, interaction with the environment and linguistic input. This is what we will see in slight detail now, because this is a very exciting area of research that has been going on for some time now. So, the concept of space is, of course, as you all know, is central to human cognition, because it provides a framework for concrete thinking as well as abstract thinking. So, we have already been talking about this, that the understanding of space also colors our understanding of time and our understanding of various other things. So, not only is spatial understanding a framework for concrete cognition, but also about abstract notions. So, humans are born with an inherent system of spatial perception and processors. So, we have the senses, as well as there are distinct neuronal networks that are dedicated to this particular function. So, so touch gives us shape, textures like vision, motor system also are all geared up. So, basically on the one hand you have the senses, the vision, auditory and haptic, and on the other hand you have the motor system geared up to work in tandem with the information that is generated to the sense. Similarly, parts of the brain like the hippocampus is dedicated to spatial memory. So, the hippocampus is the domain in the brain that maintains a map of the environment. That is why if we have been to one place and we have already created a map in our head, and next time we do not have to learn it anew. So, there is already a mechanism in place. Similarly, there are many other brain regions that are responsible for processing this information. So, basically it means that humans are born with the with various tools, so to say, to understand and deal with, to maneuver spatial information and negotiate the same for our life. So, when it comes to language, on the other hand, so spatial cognition, spatial perception is on the one hand, language on the other hand. So, when we look at we look at space, when we look at objects in space, we basically break it down into a figure and an object, and then the figure and the object moves in terms of then. So, language selects one portion of a scene. So, basically we are talking about a figure in terms of a ground, let us say. So, there is a car in front of the building. So, the car becomes the figure which is the object of the sentence, and then we understand it in terms of the larger object which is the ground. But it may not be that we may not sometimes also need a ground, we can simply talk about the object as the figure, and the figure moves from point A to point B. So, the car went from this building from my house to the market, and so on and so forth. So, when we talk about, when we think about, we use language to talk about space and spatial arrangements, we basically break it down to certain smaller units, and these are the units. Now, bringing them together, what we do is basically we have the figures, we have the layout in our mind, and then how we look at the layout is what we call the spatial conception in terms of human spatial conception. So, how we really look at the world, fine, we have understood in terms of the figure and the ground and how we look at it in terms of image schemas, but is it all? Turns out that it is not all, because there is something called a frame of reference. So, we create a frame, we kind of create coordinates in the environment in the on different planes, and the vertical and the horizontal plane, and we divide the atmosphere into coordinates, and accordingly create a language, accordingly create a framework in order to talk about space and spatial arrangements. So, one of the most commonly utilized frame is what we call relative frame. So, let us start our journey with relative frame. So, what happens in relative frame is that the horizontal plane is divided into front, back, left, right halves. So, importing the ego's body axis. So, the ego, the person who is speaking, right now I am speaking. So, I am the ego in this case. So, in my dependent on my orientation, the way I am located in space, taking that as a cue, now I can divide the horizontal axis into front, back, left, right and so on, and then talk about them in terms of in front of him, behind him and so on and so forth. So, the chair is in front of me, the screen is behind me and so on and so forth. So, this is what it means. This consequence of this system of horizontal direction is that it changes according to the ego's position and orientation. So, we are talking about various systems, various frames of reference in terms of spatial arrangement. One of these frame is called the relative frame of reference. What happens in relative frame of reference is that it is relative to the ego. So, the person who is speaking. So, depending on who is speaking, we kind of create coordinates on the surroundings, on the environment, and have a, basically we divide it into front and back and left and right and top and down and so on and so forth. And then in linguistic terms, we talk about x is in front of me, x is behind me, x is to my right, to my left, and so on and so forth. So, the moment it becomes relative to the ego's position, it will change depending on the ego. So, if when I am speaking, something is in front of me, but then if the speaker changes, another person is talking about the same object, it might be described in a very different terms. So, this is what we mean by relative system. Relative system terminologies differ in terms of the change of the position of the speaker. So, if the speaker changes or even the simply the orientation of the speaker changes. So, right now I am facing this side, if I face this side, what is in front of me now will become to my left. So, this is what we mean by the speaker's position and orientation will change the entire understanding. So, this is a viewer centric frame, because the viewer is at the core of it. So, objects are represented in a retinocentric, head centric and body centric coordinate system. That is something we have already talked about. They basically mean the same thing. So, the head and the body and the retina. So, the way we are looking. So, something that is in front of my eyes is in front of me simply. Now, this seems very commonsensical. Yes, that is how we all talk about it, but it turns out that is not all about it. There are languages in the world which do not use this kind of a coordinate schema, coordinate system of spatial arrangement to talk about objects. There are languages which use what we call an absolute system. Absolute system is when the orientation and the location of objects depend on some fixed coordinates, something like north, south, east and west, the cardinal directions that we use in case of English language. So, what is north will always remain north no matter where I am. Even if somebody else is talking about it sitting on in that corner of the room, it will still remain to the north. So, the Kashmir is to the north of India, Kanyakumari is in the south of India, that remains irrespective of wherever we are sitting in India and talking about Kashmir or Kanyakumari. So, this is what is called absolute system. Typically, most languages of the world use this absolute system to talk about a large geographical area, large like we are talking about a map and something like this, or even a smaller scale, but still maps. So, West Bengal is to the west of Assam and so on and so forth. However, there are languages in the world which uses a cardinal direction system, which is absolute system, to talk about even small things, right. Just now I said that the chair is in front of me, the screen is behind me. Those languages will not use in front of or behind or left or right, they will still use a north south sort of a direction. They have different coordinates, but it is similar to north south because they depend on the cardinal directions. So, this is as a result an environment centric frame. So, relative frame is a egocentric frame, the speaker centric frame, but in this case it is environment centered frame, as a result of which objects are represented with respect to salient features of the environment. It can be different from one language to another, sometimes it can be some landmark, sometimes it can be gravity, sometimes some kind of a mountain or a river or something from there from where the coordinates are derived. As a result of which the position of the objects in space will not change depending on the ego's position. So, something like this will be a common way of talking in these languages. So, the toy is to the north of the bed, we do not talk about it. We can say toy is to the to the right of the bed or to the left of the bed or on top of the bed or so on, but they will say these languages will use north, south, east, west to denote the location, spatial location of objects using this kind of a cardinal system. And that is where the schemata differs. The primary image schema with respect to space is different in these two frames of reference. They are called FOR. This is how it is written, frame of reference, F for frame, O for of and reference. There is a third kind of frame of reference as well, which is called intrinsic. Now, intrinsic frame of reference locates the figure with respect to ground. Now, this is an object centered frame. So, objects are coded with respect to their intrinsic axis. So, the ground that is the bigger object with respect to which the figure is located, the ground will be given a kind of a coordinate system, as if the ground itself has a some kind of an axis, which of course is derived from the ego's axis. So, the foot of the bed is always down and the top of the head of the tree is always up. So, basically importing the or let us say the transporting the ego's axis onto the object and thereby giving it as if it has its intrinsic orientation and so on, and then deciding the location of the figure with respect to that ground. So, this is called intrinsic. Intrinsic frame of reference is also utilized sometimes in all languages, in English or other languages as well as in smaller languages. Now, why are we even talking about it? It is fine. I mean, most of the languages use a relative frame of reference. Most of the world's languages use the ego as the starting point for locating objects in space and so on and so forth. So, and some languages do not, but then why is it important? Why is it important to know that a particular language divides creates a different axis on the basis of which the spatial schemata is created and talked about? Is it really important, and if so, how? So, their underlying computation is what is of interest for us. Various source of input and their various outputs point towards inner language of spatial conception. So, basically in terms of the frame of reference that we are using, we are basically taken to a very different inner language. So, in case of intrinsic, cognitive system parses objects into their major parts. So, when you are using an intrinsic system, we are talking about, so the bird is sitting at on the head of the tree. So, we are basically parsing the tree into different parts. So, it has a head, it has foot and so on and so forth. It may depend on the oriented template or the functional criteria. So, the face of a building, the building was defaced, meaning that a building has a face. The front of a building, which is the front of a building? Typically the side of the building where the entry gate is. So, this is what we mean by functional criteria. So, an object having and taking up an axis, taking up its own coordinates dependent on various kinds of criteria, either oriented template like a tree or the building having a face and so on. So, this is how we parse the object. In the relative frame of reference, we lift the axis from the self and then rotate and apply it to other objects. An absolute but our most important, most interesting frame of reference is the absolute system, because what happens in this particular frame of reference is that the speaker must know at all times and all locations where the fixed bearings are. For many of us, to locate what is to the north of this building will take a few moments. It can actually be a spectrum. For me, it might take more than moments, for some people it might be quicker, but we will take some time to really figure out what lies to the north of this building sitting inside the room. But if we are using a system or an absolute frame of reference, one has to be, the speakers of those languages have to be at all times aware of those fixed coordinates as to where your north and where your south and where your east and so on and so forth exist at all given point of time. As a result of which, the speakers run a mental compass all the time they are running a mental compass, and a constant background computation is going on. So, How do we know that? There are many studies that have been carried out on these languages. One of them is Balinese, which has this kind of a coordinate system. They have 4 ways of directions which remains constant, which is utilized for denoting spatial location to objects even at a smaller scale. So, like the objects on this table will be talked about in terms of this kind of 4 major orientation. So, this orientation is derived from a central mountain, which is considered sacred. So, depending on that mountain's location, everything else is. So, direction of the mountain, direction to the sea, and then of course, the sun, and then opposite. So, like this, these are the coordinates in this language. So, what happens is that these are space games utilized by the Nijmegen group, where they talk about. So, this is the English description. There is a scene where they have to describe the scene. The description in English would be like this, but in Bali, in this language, Balinese language, this is how it will be described. One man is cow and the other is on Kangin and so whatever, and this is how it goes on. So, basically it is something like north, south. So, two men are standing side by side, rather than saying that, because side by side has no meaning when you are using a your fixed coordinate. So, one has to be on the north, one has to be on the south, and so on. And then one who is on the north is looking towards yet another direction, right, and each holding a stick. So, like this, the other one is looking on the opposite side. You see this is how it goes. Even on a small scale, a person standing, 2 people standing next to each other and holding a stick in each of their hands, looking on the opposite direction will be described using this kind of a coordinate. So, this is what we mean being constantly aware of the coordinates all the time. Similarly, this is yet another language which also uses roughly translatable to north, south, east, west coordinate with respect to the absolutive system. This is how a sentence in that language looks like. So, I left my mother in the east, inside the building to the north, send him from the east. Of course, it might not mean much to us, but the speakers and hearers of that language perfectly understand what the meaning in this case is. So, what we have seen in this case in absolutive frame of reference is that it creates a very different spatial schemata to understand the coordinates, to give voice to the coordinates in space, and with respect to which the objects, the location as well as movement are understood, and which is very different. And because of this difference, we can derive the understanding that there is a constant computation that is running in the mind of these people. Now, the implications for this is that they are expected to know the cardinal directions at all point with respect to in all positions of the ego. Now, even though the directions do not change with respect to the ego as in relative frame of reference, remember in relative frame of reference we will be having the front, back, left, right will change if the ego's position and the position changes. But in this case the ego may move around, but the coordinates remain the same. So, now the ego has to position himself with respect to the coordinate rather than the other way around. So, this is what makes it very tricky affair, and the best part of the story is that there have been many studies carried out on these groups and many experiments, and they have been always able to dead reckon the location of objects with very less error rate, very less error rate. So, in all positions they have taken researchers have taken them in circles in the forest and left them somewhere and then asked where x is, they have been able to tell. Similarly, many other such experiments have been carried out, and a constant mental computation has been found to be giving out very less error rate. So, basically it means that they are somehow. So, because of this kind of a frame of reference existing in this language, because of which they can probably have a much finer understanding, much finer computational capacity with respect to locating objects in space with respect to the coordinates. And this is something very interesting, because it might actually help us understand as to how this kind of computation really takes place. So, there are many studies that have been going on. This is one such famous study where So, the study was like this. First, the subjects were facing north and they were taken to a room, and there were these two tables, right. And then this is how the objects were. There is this object on the left and this is on the right. The subject is facing like this way now. They see these objects and on a table, and then they are taken out of the room and taken to yet another room. Now, the crucial manipulation here is that the room on this side, when they are coming into this room, the tables are on this part of the room, as a result of which now when the subject comes into this room and faces the table, he is actually facing south. So, in the previous room he was facing north, this room he is facing south, and then they were asked to pick up that table which has the same arrangement of the objects they saw in the previous room. So, in the previous room they saw this table where the black object was on to the left of the white object, that is for us if we speak in English. So, if we come back to this room and then now we face these two tables, for us this is the table that represents the previous table, that matches with the previous table. But for these people, they will always pick up this particular table in terms of if you ask them which is the table they saw before. So, this is the table they will pick up. Why? Because this depends on the absolute frame of reference, because this object, the location of this object vis-a-vis this object does not change even if the ego has changed its position as well as orientation. Remember, here he was looking at this way, here he is looking at this way. However, it will change only if you are deriving the location of the object with respect to yourself, the ego, the viewer, but that is not happening in this particular case. So, all the absolute speakers have always gone for this solution rather than this solution. This will be the solution picked up by a speaker of an English language, for example, or a Hindi, or many of these languages. However, this is what it means. This is what how experimentally we researchers have been able to show what it actually means to have an absolute frame of reference. So, this table is the same as this table because they are in terms of the cardinal directions, their position has not changed. Similarly, similar mechanism has been utilized, similar logic has been also utilized to check the absolute frame of reference people carrying out non-linguistic tasks. So, here they are not using language at all, they are not using the terms for those spatial arrangements, they are simply carrying out a task that requires them to understand, identify and accordingly place objects in space, and this is where we see the relationship of the spatial language on the spatial cognition. So, there is a lot of study, there has been a lot of study still going on as to whether the language actually shapes the cognition in this particular domain. So, does your spatial language change your spatial cognition or not? But so far we know that there is a connection, because this language uses absolute terms to locate objects in space, and this is visible in also the way they actually understand those objects even when language is not utilized. So, basically what is the take home lesson from this the study is that the system of thinking about space is against that hypothesis that universally all spatial conception is based on coordinates based on the human body. So, this basically cancels, or let us say it rejects the idea that all spatial conception, all spatial schemata is body based. It is not always body based. In fact, there are various kinds of other centric coordinates that are also there, which are perfectly usable, and they are used in spatial cognition. So, the computing device does not alone determine the cognitive architecture, which means that linguistic diversity aligns with cognitive diversity, because there is a diversity in terms of how you talk about space, how you talk about objects in space, you are also thinking of them differently. So, probably there are different coordinates, probably there are different ways of creating that schemata in terms of image schema as far as space is concerned. So, spatial tasks have results from spatial tasks have shown us this particular aspect of the schemata with respect to spatial cognition. So, this is what we had in terms of image schema. Image schema, the description, the analysis and its usage in various domains of research and so on. So, here we also have some supplementary material. These are the image schemas, because all the schemas were not discussed in detail before, but there this is the list that Johnson gives in his book, a large number of schemas, and then these are some examples of how the schema is actually represented in a schematic, so to say schematic way. This is how it is represented. So, this is the path schema, in out schema, this is the landmark from which something is going out. So, the trajectory is moving out of the landmark. So, this is in and this is out, and this is of course, the container schema. Interior, this object is inside. So, x this is in the container. So, there is an interior, there is an exterior and there is a boundary and so on. So, this is how schemas are represented in literature, and these are the references. Thank you.